Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to day 2 of the Healthy Kids, Healthy Future Technical Assistance Program Convening. Thank you so very much for joining us. I'm Caliste Chong with Nemours Children's Health, and I'm honored to kick off day 2. It's exciting to see so many partners gathered together from all across the nation to discuss ways that we can ensure young children are provided the healthiest start in life possible. I was so inspired by the stories of the work being done to advance outdoor learning environments yesterday, both by the presenters and by all of you that shared in the chat about some of the work that you're doing as well. I just want to say that your work is admirable and it truly makes a difference. And we recognize that this work is really tough and it takes time, sometimes many, many years to really make some impactful changes. And we just want to commend your dedication and persistence to the impact that you have made in your state. As you join us, we'd love for you to introduce yourself in the chat. You can share your name, your state, and your role. We'd love to just know who's here and what state you're from. You can opt into viewing closed captions for this event if you click on the Show Captions button at the bottom of your screen. And now I'm just going to turn it over to Trevor Lee, a Program and Policy Analyst with our Early Care and Education team here at Nemours, and he's going to lead us in a brief physical activity. And for some of us, it's a little bit late in the day, and for our Hawaii partners, it's early in the morning, so I think it'll be really great to move just a bit. So thank you, Trevor.
Thank you, Caliste. Good afternoon, everybody. For those of you that I haven't met yet, my name is Trevor Lee with Nemours, and I just wanted to start us off with a quick physical activity break. Like Caliste said, a little bit of movement will hopefully get us energized, especially after lunch. So for this activity, feel free to turn your cameras on or off if it makes you more comfortable. So what is the most recent sport or physical activity you've tried for the first time or would like to try soon? You can share your answers in the chat and we'll pick a few and ask the person who shared the activity to do a quick demonstration of the motions and movements. And then everybody will be able to follow along with those. So I can get us started off. I recently have been hearing a lot about this sport and just over the weekend saw a match on TV and that is pickleball. So for this one, just kind of do a little paddle back and forth. Serving the ball out, hitting it, going back and forth. And another one that I have been thinking of with the summer coming up and the weather is feeling very nice. I have been wanting to try kayaking for the first time. So we can hop in our little boat with our oar and start to paddle. Back and forth, nice. Does anybody else have any suggestions?
I saw volleyball.
I see. Volleyball?
I saw volleyball in the chat, yeah.
Cool. Sorry about that. I'm seeing the chat now too. I see pickleball mentioned a few times actually, but volleyball, yep. We can do a nice serve and hit over the net. Back and forth, a little volley. And I've also been thinking about trying rock climbing as well. So a nice little scale up the wall, I guess. Get the arms moving. I see Kimberly mentioned she wants to try exercise bikes on the water. That sounds interesting. I guess it's the nice little bike motion. Cool.
I've never actually been paddleboarding before, but it's something that I want to try.
Paddleboarding definitely looks fun. Swinging back and forth. Diane said she recently started golf lessons. Nice. I took golf lessons a long time ago. So my stroke probably doesn't look good, but back in the swing.
And Robin from NC State mentioned pebble skipping on ponds or rivers. That's a good one. You stand up, that can be a full body experience too.
Definitely is. Getting some good exercise right now. Cool. Well, this was definitely a nice warm up to this session. Thank you all for participating. Back to you, Caliste.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Trevor. And before I start, this is my little one, my youngest, Eli. He's 7 years old. I like to throw pictures of my kids in whenever I can and have an opportunity. So welcome again to day 2. Before we jump into today's content, let's talk just a little bit about day 1. Yesterday's program was packed full of a lot of information and meaningful reminders of how important this work that you all do is. If you participated in day 1, we'd love for you to share your greatest takeaways in the chat. If you'd like to unmute and share, you're welcome to do that as well. If you'll use the hand raise function, that'll be really helpful for us if you would like to speak. And we would love to hear any of your takeaways and ideas, thoughts that you had from yesterday. So as you're thinking about day 1, I'll share a quick recap of some of the things that we learned and heard. So Rochelle and Carrie opened us up yesterday with several remarks, and I think that their remarks really helped set the stage for day 1 for they provided a lot of really important context and a national view on how states are using the spectrum of opportunities to guide and inform strategies to create healthy childcare systems and settings. Nilda and Robin from the Natural Learning Initiative shared information from a recent fascinating study they conducted on gardening. They found that gardening with children in early care and education programs increased moderate to vigorous physical activity time by 6 minutes a day for children and decreased sedentary time by 14 minutes a day, which in the grand scheme of things, that is really impactful. They found the impact on younger children was even greater than for those that were around 5 years old. This research, I think, underscores the impact gardening can have on young children, and it really makes the case for offering gardening experiences as early as 3 years. So Robin also shared some really helpful information about gardening and lots of resources that we hope that you all will check out. We'll send a follow-up email by the end of this week with all of those resources in case you were wondering. Then during the second half of our convening yesterday, we heard from South Carolina and Wisconsin about their outdoor learning environments journey. Some nuggets that I heard shared from these states are just how important it is to engage childcare licensing in your outdoor learning environments conversations. And not just as an add-on, not a partner that's just an add-on in your stakeholder group, but really as a core partner, engaging them in the initial conversations and all of the meaningful, really digging into the work type of conversations. And while some licensing standards might be a little more rigid because of health and safety regulations, we can help inform how those standards are translated on the ground by licensing consultants and others, even the childcare providers. And we learned that there's some standards that are a little bit more flexible than others. We were reminded that the most important aspect of our work is really bringing partners together and building relationships. Relationships are key to progress, and Wisconsin partners always share the quote that change happens at the speed of trust. And that has stuck with me for years since I first heard it from them. And I found it to be really true. The more that we build relationships with those that we labor among, with those that we work so closely with, especially our state agency partners or other key partners in our states, it helps to build that trust, and we're able to make changes a lot more quickly, I found. And then in the closing, Nathan Larson from Wisconsin shared some really inspiring stories of how impactful outdoor learning environments and gardening can be on young children and even childcare providers. And I hope that his stories reminded everyone of why you do the work that you do. And as many of us work at the national and the state level, it's sometimes hard to see that impact on the ground. I know that I struggle with that even in my work now. But as we're toiling and working so hard to create equitable state systems changes, it's activities like those that Nathan shared that are happening on the ground that make all of our efforts so worthwhile. He also shared a great reminder that we should all experience everyday awe and to cultivate a sense of wonder. And I thought that that really stuck with me as well. Anyone have any other reflections that they like to share? You can just unmute or you can raise your hand. And I see there's a lot in the chat box. So Rochelle said, just preparing, caring, harvesting. It applies to gardens, but also all of our work as well. The North Carolina story about Mythbusters. You'll have to listen to the recording if you missed that. Any others that you would like to share? Lori, would you like to unmute and share a little bit about what you added to the chat box?
Sure, I can do that. Hi, everybody. It's Lori McMonigal. I'm from Pennsylvania, and I work closely with many partners in our state with support and funding from Department of Health on children's health initiatives. And so we do a lot of collaborative activities within our state. So for me, this has been a great opportunity just to hear from multiple states about the different strategies, the way things look in other states and other settings. And I really did appreciate, I know you mentioned it, the licensing piece as, you know, a critical partner, but thinking about full partnership, shared professional development and learning, and just, you know, not they're an amazing resource, but not to look beyond that and look at partnership versus just a resource and think about things we can do together. So yeah, everything's been great, but those were just my first thoughts in the takeaways.
Awesome. I appreciate you so much for sharing. All right, next slide. And then while we know that states across the nation are working to create healthy childcare programs and policies, state systems changes, we'd just like to acknowledge that through the various grants and types of programming, especially the Healthy Kids, Healthy Future Technical Assistance Program, our small but mighty ECE team at the Nemours Children's Health National Office has reached 38 states and the District of Columbia over the last 5 years. And I would just like to say that we express our sincerest gratitude for the states that have engaged with us and that have grown with us over the years. And while we don't know what the future holds, I hope that we will continue to be able to move forward in this work and to support one another in whatever ways possible. So let's just keep this work moving forward. And now I'm going to turn it over to Hannah Press with Nemours Children's Health. She is a senior state system specialist here at Nemours, and she's going to go over the agenda for today.
Thanks, Caliste. We have a great agenda today with wonderful presenters from Child Care Aware of America, Pennsylvania, and Vermont. And we'll end our time today with a panel discussion from all of our presenters. So our agenda for the day is being added to the chat, but you can also view it on the Convening website online, and a link to that's also going to be dropped in the chat. As I mentioned, we're going to be wrapping up the day with a panel, so we'll be compiling your questions throughout the event today. And we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. So feel free to throw them in the chat box. And if you need any support throughout the event today, please feel free to send a message to Caliste or myself. We're more than happy to help. So with that, I would like to introduce our friends at Child Care Aware of America who will be presenting today. Alex Cooper is a Child Care Aware of America's Geospatial Research Analyst. Jasmin Springfield is Child Care Aware of America's GIS Research Associate, and Diane Girouard is the State Policy Senior Analyst with Child Care Aware of America. And we're thrilled to have them here today to talk about going beyond the map to strengthen children's health through childcare and the Child and Adult Care Food Program. So with that, I will pass it over to the Child Care Aware of America team.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you everyone for joining our session. Again, going beyond the map to strengthen children's health through childcare and CACFP. Today, we wanted to share with you this 5-year mapping initiative that highlights 3 topics: how Child and Adult Food Care Program, or CACFP, can play an important role in reducing food insecurity, especially for children being served in ECE settings. 2, how useful data and maps can be in presenting information for ECE leaders and policymakers to make informed decisions about how to support children's families and providers. And 3, how these story maps can be used to make the case for improvement and expansion to CACFP in your state under a section of the story maps that we call strategies for change. Next slide, please. As Hannah mentioned, my name is Jasmin Springfield. We work at Child Care Aware of America. I'm the GIS Research Associate, and I have my mapping partner, Alex Cooper, the Geospatial Research Analyst. And we work closely with also Diane Girouard, the State Policy Senior Analyst. Next slide. So our agenda for this, for our presentation is to give an overview of this mapping ECE participation in CACFP, then talk more about strategies for change and ways in which other states may have used the map. And then lastly, talk about sustainability efforts and next steps and lesson learned of this mapping resource we created. Next slide. Children in childcare settings benefit significantly from receiving healthy meals and snacks, supporting their growing bodies and bolstering healthy development. The Child and Adult Food Care Program, CACFP, is a federal program administered by the U.S. Department of Agriculture that reimburses childcare providers and adult daycare centers for serving nutritious meals and snacks to children and adults in their care. CCAOA, we collaborated with Nemours to provide their state grantees interactive GIS story maps. These story maps are web-based applications that allow you to share your maps in the context of geographically layered data, narrative text, and other multimedia content. As you can see on your screen, we have a short silent demo playing on the screen to give you an idea of what the story map and the map dashboard will look like. For context, CACFP was established in 1968 by Congress to expand its federal nutrition programs to provide daily nutritious meals and snacks to children in childcare programs. This program is administered through the USDA through grants to states, which then provide reimbursements to eligible sponsors for each qualifying meal they serve. Eligible sponsors include childcare centers, family childcare programs, Head Start programs, after-school programs, and homeless shelters. Participating programs can provide meals to children up to age 12 and must meet federal nutrition standards and meal patterns set by the USDA to be reimbursed. As a highlight, childcare resource and referral agencies are equipped to help childcare providers participate in CACFP. CCRNRs provide technical assistance to help with paperwork and enroll programs in CACFP, and in some cases act as sponsoring agencies to help administer the program. And CCRNRs can also help make connections between providers and nutrition coaches who share strategies with providers to promote healthy food financing initiatives. For example, Child Care Aware of North Dakota helps providers identify local food sponsors and raise awareness of the program's benefits among non-participating providers. So going back to the mapping initiative, this mapping project that we have, our story maps feature childcare program status in CACFP, which is based on the data we receive from the state partners. Then we overlay and analyze that data with food deserts from the USDA and family poverty data. And then, the family poverty data, which is the percent of families with children under 5 living below 185% of the federal poverty level. And we get that from the US Census. Next slide.
Thank you, Jasmin. And over the past 5 years, CCAOA, in collaboration with Nemours, has mapped CACFP participation across 21 states, including Washington, D.C. We're now in year 5, the final year, currently mapping 5 states: Hawaii, Montana, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Tennessee. Looking at the 2022 states data alone, 6 out of 7 states have between 20 to 60% of childcare providers who are already participating in CACFP. And really the goal of our collective data efforts and map creation is to help states identify underserved communities that would greatly benefit from CACFP expansion in childcare so they can more effectively target their efforts in finding out what areas are really primed for that expansion work. Next slide, please. And throughout these 5 years, we've attempted to really be nimble and reactive to what we learn. We're not perfect at CCAOA, and this process has definitely been a learn by doing experience. And we can use each year as an opportunity to learn and make the next year even more successful. So as a form of project evaluation, we've even started making it a standard practice to meet with our Nemours partners to quote unquote sunset each year before we openly discuss what went well, what could have gone better, and strategies that we could use to enhance the process to make these story maps and the process by which they're created even better. So the core map and the layers and the deliverables that we started out with in year 1, 2019, our initial goal was to create a story map visualizing childcare programs and whether they or not they participate in CACFP. And for each map, we joined states' data with publicly accessible sources to visualize childcare programs and providers to help states more precisely target the outreach. The map included childcare programs, a food desert layer, and the family poverty layer that Jasmin mentioned earlier from the US Census. And we created a draft map for the states to review and solicited their feedback about its aesthetics and the data that it displayed. After we received the feedback, we would author the story map that narratively described what the data were showing us. Additionally, we began suggesting a list of what we called strategies for change, or administrative or policy suggestions to improve and expand CACFP that complements the data that the map were displaying. And Diane Girouard will talk at some length at least, about these strategies for change very soon. And at the end of every story map, we made it standard practice to embed an interactive map that included all of the data layers that were discussed throughout the story map. And this allowed users to interact with the simplified map to explore the data on their own. Users could go into their own communities, zoom around the map, and see which providers in their communities were and weren't participating in CACFP, and where the layers, where the data show where there might be food deserts or high levels of family poverty and where those intersected. And that's the type of area that we would suggest, or that at least that we would say the data suggest would be good to expand CACFP. Next slide, please. And in thinking about how we grew and developed this process over time, we started to include even more sections to try to add to the conversation. So for example, in our second year, we started quote unquote spotlighting certain areas of each state that we worked with to zoom in and really try to demonstrate a tangible example of how one might use the map to analyze expansion at a small scale. And we gradually enhanced these spotlight sections over the years to really be a standard part of every data set in a state's story map. So usually we total about 3 to 4 spotlight sections per state. And we try hard to not only zoom into cities where there are a lot of providers all concentrated in a certain area, but we try to also give small town and rural level explanations of how people all across the state, as varied as their geographies are, can really use this map as a tool to look at expansion in their communities. Next slide. And as our ArcGIS online mapping platform continues to evolve and has done so considerably in the past 5 years since we started this project, we've tried to develop more robust mapping procedures along with it. So for instance, we gave both the story map and those maps at the bottom a bit of a facelift, if you will. We most notably began in year 3, transforming the final interactive map into a more fleshed out and full map dashboard, which you see here on the screen. And that introduced all sorts of filters and infographics for even more utility and user interaction. For instance, a user could filter only CACFP providers or only those providers that weren't participating, and all of these numbers and graphs on the dashboard would update, and the map would do so as well. Users can zoom into their own counties and look at the statistics and see how they update there. And so the idea is to give the users even more tools to use the story map to go beyond that set story map narrative, and to use the dashboard and democratize that data and allow for more expansive efforts for CACFP expansion. Next slide, please. And throughout this whole process, we continually heard requests from our state partners to add other layers to the map. And really, the beauty of GIS is that you can add as many layers to the map as you want, and you can look at data in a single space simultaneously and see how different data is across space, geographically, how they interact. And so other states asked for different data sets to be a part of their story map. And we wanted to be able to, at some level, acquiesce to this request and give that extra context to every state situation. We recognize that every state is different and the situations may vary. And in order to move towards honoring these requests, we created what we called a wildcard menu full of wildcard data sets, extra data sets such as Diversity Data Kids Child Opportunity Index, or the CDC Social Vulnerability Index, and Feeding America's Mapping the Meal Gap map layer. And we gave the states the option to choose one additional data set for us to map and include in the story map. And we would write out a full narrative section of that data as well. And we limited that menu to about 8 wildcard data sources that we vetted at CCAOA, because we felt like we could trust those data sources and that we could write a meaningful section of the story map with our states that would add to the conversation about what children are experiencing all across these states and how that intersects with CACFP participation, and how expanding that program could help, and what that tells us about alongside these different data sets. Next slide, please. And over the years, we learned, along with our states and Nemours, that the data that were required to even produce these maps is often extremely difficult to obtain and, more importantly, clean and merge property. More on this later. We often learn the hard way by experiencing more than just a few data issues with our state partners. And we had to work through that. And so we developed through our Sunset project evaluation I mentioned earlier, we developed with Nemours a standard data QA, or quality assurance, process to try to help alleviate some of these problems. Now, this required that when states clean and merge their CACFP and licensing data together, that they review the results internally, very critically, but also do so along with a council of local stakeholders and their CACFP agency to check their data in the merged results for accuracy. Then, before even creating that nice finalized map dashboard, we at CCA would take that QA data, we would put it up on a scratch map, just a very simple, no frills map with just that childcare provider data up there. It didn't look nice, but it had all the data. And we would return it to the states and ask that they take one more look at it with their stakeholders to go through another review cycle to ensure that the data is accurate. Because sometimes you just may not catch the data errors if it's sitting there in an Excel spreadsheet and you're just looking through raw data, and you may not catch the errors, if there are any, till you see it mapped and graphed. And you can go through and you can look and see, oh, wait, this provider is listed in this county, but really it should be all the way across the state. So that's one of the useful benefits and the power of GIS, Geographic Information Systems mapping. Next slide. I think one of the most key elements that we enhanced over this entire 5 years has been the Strategies for Change section. And we've moved from just a boilerplate list of potential policies and administrative steps that can help expand CACFP to really trying to give the states an opportunity, individualized opportunity to work with Diane Girouard, our state policy analyst, to think about very tailored and state-specific strategies to expand CACFP. So now I'm going to ask if Diane wouldn't mind jumping in and telling us all about it. Diane?
Great. Thanks, Alex. And thanks, Jasmin, for really laying the land of what the mapping looks like. And so I'm going to take everyone away from more so looking at the details of the maps and the different layers and into a policy conversation. Again, my name is Diane Girouard. I'm Child Care of America's State Policy Senior Analyst, and my goal as part of this project is to help make that connection between the story map data that Alex and Jasmin just shared about, and then policy changes, whether it be big or small incremental changes, where we can improve and expand CACFP, and how we can take the next steps with these maps and what might those next steps look like in different states. We'll go to the next slide, please. So I thought it would be helpful just to, good for framing, and I apologize if this got discussed yesterday, I was unable to make it to the presentation, but just sharing a national perspective of what CACFP participation has looked like over the years to frame, again, the conversation that we're on policy and next steps with the maps. And so you can kind of think about this, especially for the end of our presentation here, about how your state has compared, what the challenges and successes have been. Even though I'm sure many of you on the call, this isn't really super new information to you, but again, let's go through it. So first on this slide, I have just posted this graph from USDA, which shows the national trends in participation among family child care programs, which you'll see in red, and then center-based programs, which you'll see in blue, from fiscal years 1989 through 2021. We see that family child care participation really peaked in 1996, 1997, which makes sense. It coincides with the same year that federal legislation was enacted that established a two-tier reimbursement structure for family child care. But then it starts to drop for family child care in the years after that. While it continues, participation continues to rise for center-based programs, really spiking a bit in 2015 and then again in 2019 before, of course, dropping in 2020. So digging into this a bit further, data from USDA shows that prior to the pandemic, total participation in CACFP grew from 2.7 million children to 4.7 million children, so a real doubling from 2000 to 2019. The growth over 2 decades was mostly concentrated around, as we can assume and guess from the map, center-based programs. Conversely, the number of children participating in CACFP who were enrolled in a family child care program dropped in the same time span from 1 million children to nearly 700,000. And then this decline coincides with a national drop in the overall supply of family child care programs too. And in fact, we have a stat from the Food Research and Action Center that more than 46% of family child care providers participating in CACFP have been lost since 1996, which is a pretty big number. In 2020, the pandemic, as we all saw, caused participation to plummet among both center-based and family child care programs. CACFP averaged about 4.3 million child and adult participants daily and served nearly 1.6 billion total meals in that year. Then those pre-pandemic trends of family child care declining in participation continued into 2020, with about, looking at the numbers specifically for family child care, about 600,000 children participated through family child care. For centers, this number dropped, looking at 2019 at 4.3 million children to 3.6. In 2021, the number of center-based programs participating in CACFP began to recover from 2020 and increased to 4.2 million children. And this is also in line with the overall supply of these programs. We're seeing that our recent data has shown that the supply of center-based childcare programs has also increased since the pandemic. But on the other hand, the number of children participating through family childcare declined even further in 2021, so dropping from 600,000 to nearly 550,000. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we know that several waivers were provided to offer more flexibility for programs and providers, including allowing family childcare programs to automatically receive the highest CACFP reimbursement rate through the end of this month. What I think we can take away from looking at participation is that these waivers and their extensions for area eligibility and the temporary increase in rates were seen as lifelines for childcare programs, both center-based and family childcare, and providers to continue feeding children in their care. Go to the next slide. So thank you. Going back to the maps, Jasmin mentioned at the beginning that we include a section, it's at the very end of the maps, called Strategies for Change. And as states work through their story maps, we ask them at the beginning, how can they use the story map to improve administration and expand CACFP enrollment participation in their state? It's the big question of, okay, we have all this robust data. Now what? What can you do with this? We consider, even though they're located at the very end of the maps, we consider the strategies for change an essential part of the story mapping process, because we know that CACFP is historically often underutilized in states for a whole host of reasons, ranging from low awareness of the program to burdensome reporting and administrative requirements, compliance with meal pattern requirements, not getting reimbursed for additional meals outside of those that are reimbursed, and inadequate reimbursement rates, especially for family child care providers outside of this waiver. So we want to use this data to reverse any numbers where there's a decrease in participation and make CACFP a better program. And what better way to help make the case for that by showing some data. So the story maps layer information, as Jasmin and Alex just talked about childcare program location, participation in CACFP, food access, and family poverty. So all of this together means there's a lot of good data that becomes available for states to use in their pitch for making the case for CACFP expansion, improvement, and further funding. We have collected and continue to update these strategies for change with each cohort, and they've evolved quite a bit. We'll move to the next slide. In the first 2 years of this project, so this is before I was on board, the strategies for change section, as Jasmin and Alex have alluded to, was developed by our former policy analyst as a list of boilerplate recommendations to support and expand CACFP. We encourage states to provide any changes to the recommendations that would best reflect their states. But for the most part, if you scroll back through maps from the first couple of cohorts, the list of strategies for change stayed pretty stagnant across the cohort and were quite long. And they weren't tailored to states' individual situations. In year 3, we started to hear feedback from the states around how to best use this mapping product. We still maintained this very long and ever-growing list that we had created starting with years 1 and 2. But this feedback got us thinking more about onboarding a policy person early in the process, especially during the individual state kickoff meetings that we hold. When we would speak to states about their CACFP landscapes and what pockets of opportunities exist for changes in participation. So in year 4, I joined the project to lead a peer-to-peer webinar to allow states participating to share what their CACFP landscape looked like in their state, and to also share ideas and windows of opportunity on how they might be able to use the robust data that was coming out of these story maps. We did this webinar at the end of the project in year 4 and realized it would be much more beneficial at the beginning to bring all the states together to share their challenges, frustrations, and also successes, as well as potential plans and where they saw some opportunities where they could use this data to make some changes. In year 4, we also started really tailoring the strategies for change section to each state. So moving away from that really big boilerplate list we had created previously, we asked states what they could realistically use the map for, knowing that not everyone was going to be able to advocate and lobby policymakers to immediately increase reimbursements or make changes to paperwork requirements. We emphasized with states that the strategies for change are unique for each state. So no 2 states are expected to choose the same strategies or even the same number of strategies. Nothing is too big or too small in ways to use this story map data. Every state, again, it's going to be different in terms of what is feasible. We do see that some states still shoot for the moon and still include a long list of strategies for change that will stem from the map, while others just include a few that realistically they believe will work best for their state. So in year 5, we made a much more formal document breaking down the different strategies for change that we've collected, we've gathered over the entire cohort of states over the last 5 years. We now have those available on our website, and I will go through them in the next couple slides in a few minutes. But that being said, while these tactics vary state to state, we have found that states generally are selecting ones that typically focus around 3 overarching categories, which I've listed here on the slide, which is to use the maps to help identify communities of need and boost awareness of CACFP among providers, sponsors, and policymakers and other ECE stakeholders. To use the data to help the underlying system to strengthen it, the types of support that are available for providers and sponsors to make enrollment and participation an easier lift and less burdensome. And to use the map to, this is kind of the big one, to help shift state and federal policies and funding streams to fortify the program overall. As I go through these 3 main buckets, you'll probably notice that some of these strategies use the story maps for very concrete short-term planning and to do some immediate outreach to providers and sponsors, while other examples are much loftier goals to use the data as a catalyst to advocate for some bigger changes to CACFP. We'll go to the next slide. So this is pulling from the resource, which looks like Alex just dropped into the chat. But getting into the first bucket around using the maps to boost awareness, some states have indicated that they'll share the map with key state partners and advocates. They'll use the map to dig into what barriers exist for participation and continued enrollment by holding community learning sessions or listening sessions where in areas with low take-up, or they'll conduct provider surveys in areas with low take-up, or reach out to areas with high levels of non-participating providers. Maybe it's something programs just don't know about, meaning the state agency or maybe their advocates can do a kind of like a marketing campaign around CACFP to raise awareness. I'll dig into our survey results in a bit, but using the maps to build partnerships and relationships across different state agencies, sponsor organizations, childcare resource and referral agencies was a very common, common feedback and a common strategy for change we've seen in the maps. And then creating resources about the program and distributing to communities with low take-up about what it takes to participate in CACFP and why it's really beneficial to do so. We've also seen states share that they have engaged childcare program ambassadors who they're going to communities based on the map of where lots of providers, there is actually a high participation level in CACFP, using the map to guide that, reaching out to providers in those communities and asking if they would be willing to be childcare ambassadors or childcare ambassadors for CACFP within their networks. They could serve as mentors and they'd be paid with stipends to do this work of getting the word out about CACFP. We'll move to the next slide. States have also thought about how they can use the story map data to inform strategies that will overall strengthen systems of support for providers and sponsors, so that programs that enroll stay in the program long-term because they feel supported. This includes using the map to recruit new sponsors in areas where there is a lack of them and determine where nutrition coaching may be needed. One state last year mentioned, and I talked a little bit about this with the ambassadors, but they called it a mentorship program that they wanted to develop between participating programs based on areas of need identified in the story maps. And in some other states have mentioned that they would like to use the map to highlight to policymakers why funding better data systems is important. I think Alex and Jasmin will talk a little bit more about that, but just the challenges that exist with current data. And if we funded better data systems, as we can pull from this mapping process, what that would mean going forward and how this would be a much easier process. We'll go to the next slide. And then states have noted that they would like to use the story maps to highlight gaps and make the case for big policy change in their conversations with state and federal policymakers. So looking at this data, sharing with policymakers why there are gaps in participation, why there is low take-up of the program, so they can then request and make recommendations to increase reimbursements with either state, also sharing with their federal policymakers. Elevate the use of the Farm to ECE program. Determine if there are any areas to review standards and streamline requirements. Support technology systems, as I just mentioned, and data sharing to improve program access for sponsors, providers, and families. Address any sort of payment delays that might exist. And champion policies that do all of these things at the federal level, including allowing family childcare to qualify for the highest tiered rates, reimburse additional meals, and increase reimbursement rates for all programs. One thing to think about, I will talk about this more a little bit too, is that if your state agency is unable to advocate or lobby or use these maps in those conversations to make the case for more increased funding for CACFP, or maybe some programmatic changes, can you share the results publicly with advocates in your community, in your state, so that they, and hold maybe a listening or learning session with them about the results, so that they, maybe through a webinar, that they can use it in their discussions with policymakers if they're able to make that advocacy ask. And we'll move to the next slide. So how are states actually using CACFP story maps so far? So we've surveyed states after the completion of the story mapping process and asked how they're using the maps now. When surveyed, states have most frequently shared that they are in the short term, again, this is just a couple of years for some, that they're including the maps so far in various plans and strategies, especially in targeted outreach to providers. Some have noted very few that they'll be using in advocacy efforts. Using the map to guide examinations of barriers to CACFP participation. And then again, this one came up a lot. I think this was our most common one. Using them in outreach to other departments, related departments working on children or food nutrition issues, and groups like childcare resource and referral agencies and United Ways and other ECE or early childhood education stakeholders, maybe holding listening sessions to help them understand the maps and how to use them. This has really helped them build new and expand existing relationships as well. We think it's important for states to envision how they'll use this data for more long-term tactics, though we realize the snapshot of data is likely immediately being used to inform these short-term plans and strategies in outreach to other agencies and with stakeholders, and to examine participation barriers, which is not a problem. All of the work that can come out of this map for next steps is really great. Go to the next slide. So I just want to share a couple of examples coming directly from the survey that we have done from prior cohorts, and in their own words, how they're using the maps. We've heard that they're using it for upcoming ambassador stipends in our Farm to ECE Local Food Makes Sense program, prioritizing certain geographic areas when expanding CACFP enrollment, and obtaining feedback from providers about barriers and facilitators to CACFP. The map has helped local communities and nutrition advocates understand in a more tangible way where they could prioritize outreach, for example, given the overlays of participation in food desert data. Include it in conversations with the childcare licensing team and subsidy team to inform outreach strategies for CACFP, including in agency policies. The map has helped many local communities and nutrition advocates understand in a more tangible way where they should prioritize outreach. And then the resulting map empowered our local early childhood councils to understand the need for more food program access in their communities and to become local advocates for expanding program access. So really great to also see that grassroots advocacy building up from the results of the story map. And then I think I'm going to quickly turn it back over to Jasmin and Alex.
Thank you, Diane. In many cases, this is the first mapping work a state agency may have around childcare providers or CACFP. Mapping has served as the first step to awareness and strategic planning. For example, while we were presenting at a state stakeholder meeting, one participant remarked that he knew there were childcare providers in the specific community, but was shocked to see a lack of CACFP participation. In other cases, some states are already working on CACFP expansion and want to merge childcare provider and CACFP data to further their work. Or some states are interested in updating already merged data for insights into changes in CACFP participation over time. Understanding states' various hopes for this project led us to build internal capacity over time to develop sustainable products that can be used for the future. So, as a standard practice, we returned the CACFP-linked childcare data to states that includes their geocoded latitude and longitude coordinates. Working with states and with Nemours' blessing, we've even discovered opportunities to collaborate with state agencies directly to further update their data after the original project deadline. Next slide.
Thank you, Jasmin. And I think that this right here highlights some of what Diane was talking about state data systems and how that's the origin point for the data themselves is itself a strategy for change, because a major challenge in ECE administration that this project has illuminated for us, for Nemours, and I'm sure many of you on the call can sympathize with this, is around data collection. So like Jasmin just mentioned, this could be a state's first time tackling a data-centered process when it comes to CACFP. And this really uncovered for all of us a major barrier to making these maps and to keeping them in good shape is a lack of childcare data cleanliness and integration. So often, for instance, in our case, this occurred because data almost always had to be pulled from multiple agencies within state government. CACFP providers and licensed ECE provider data are almost never housed in the same state agency. And so we've got to pull them from two separate places and merge them together in order to give an accurate analysis of CACFP participation. Even basic statistics like how many providers are participating in CACFP already, divided by the total number of providers in the state. We need these data linked in order for these detailed analyses to be given. However, these data rarely have a standard linking variable. So across data sets, if you'll allow me to be a bit in the data wonkiness weeds here, we would really advocate for using a unique provider ID number across data sets, just like a business ID, or even us as people here in the US, we have social security numbers, some sort of unique identifier that doesn't change across data sets. And we can try to go off of provider names and addresses, But even with this, it usually does not map cleanly. And we've had a lot of issues trying to merge data across 2 or 3 data sets to make these GIS maps. We've had instances where there's been discrepancies in what licensed even means, to where we'll end up with one data set with 1,000 providers and another data set with like 300. We've had data issues where data have been moved a little bit in the rows, and we haven't been able, and so the names of the providers have popped up on the incorrect points. Or we just have such messy data from state agencies or the subunits that house them that we receive, that even working with us, we find it difficult to merge across these data sets. So this is the reason why I mentioned earlier, we developed the data quality assurance procedures where we worked with the states, and Nemours worked with the states and their local stakeholders to really try to check and make sure that the data is right before we produce these story maps and put a lot of work into this. We want to make sure that we're analyzing the correct data up front. But off of this, we really see an opportunity to develop a methodology for this work that continues to learn from our mistakes and our successes in this process, and to help states build internal capacity. You know, we could have a perfect methodology at CCAOA, but what we really hope that can come out of this work, and it's why Jasmin mentioned we return the data to the state partners that we work with, is that we hope that that data can be a catalyst for improving the data systems and the data records that states have to work with. So we were excited to learn, you'll get to hear from Tiffany from Pennsylvania here pretty soon, but that Pennsylvania is including as a really nice step forward. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the CACFP provider ID number is now an entry into their licensing application form. So when a provider applies to be licensed, then they also have a chance to put that CACFP identifying number, which is the exact thing that we need in order to be able to analyze CACFP geographically. Ultimately, it really comes down to, and it's this whole process is highlighted for us at CCAOA, the importance of data interoperability, or at least data integration across state data systems. This will allow for more clean data that can help support states in analyzing and really increasing the efficiency and probably the cost effectiveness of these systems long term. And it's all moving towards creating better, more robust, and more helpful systems that can support and strengthen children's well-being. So we want to move towards that as our ultimate goal. And we think that further building internal state capacity in ways that enhance data systems would be just such a really monumental and great way to do that. Diane, any other thoughts on the program here and our takeaways from our mapping?
I think you cover them really well. And I think I've got one more slide after you to talk about some next steps. Thanks. All right, we'll go to the next slide. Thank you. So I put this up here because I think it's, as we think about next steps, we have a divided Congress. So I think it can be safely assumed that big overhauls and pieces of legislation outside of annual appropriations are probably unlikely at this time, and changes, if they are going to happen, are more likely happen locally and at the state level. And so you're just really quickly thinking about what opportunities exist to build relationships between the food and nutrition and health communities and the childcare and early learning communities. I think there are a couple of spaces that come to mind. So the first one being, this is a little bit later in the game, but COVID-19 relief funding, especially that, any funding that is left over for childcare. Are there any last opportunities to shape state plans on the use of funds? Remaining funds need to be spent. There's a deadline of this September, but then there's some remaining funds to help build the quality of programs for September 2024. But again, is there an opportunity there to really bridge the gap or bridge any relationships between food, nutrition, health, and childcare and early learning to see where other relief funding might be able to support CACFP or other health and nutrition supports for children and early learning programs. I threw up there on this slide as well as the CCDF state planning process for 2025-2027, which is shocking to me to even think that we are getting to that point of the public input period soon. But is there a chance to comment and provide public input on these state childcare plans? And can you use the data to inform any of the goals? I know that I think North Carolina was able to include farm to ECE in their 2022-2024 or mention of farm to ECE in their childcare and development state plans. And if there's a public input process that is required with these plans, if you cannot publicly advocate or lobby or feel comfortable sharing this information as part of that process, can you again get this data into the hands of your anti-hunger or early childhood advocates so they can include it in their testimony, especially around the gaps that exist. And then I know this had come up previously, prior this, or almost a year ago at this point, but the White House does have a challenge to end hunger and build healthy communities. And through this challenge, the administration is encouraging stakeholders across all sectors of society to make bold and impactful commitments that will collectively achieve the goals of ending hunger and increasing healthy eating and physical activity by 2023. The administration is encouraging communities and organizations to participate in this challenge by making bold and impactful commitments in one or more of the 5 pillars of this national strategy that they've put together. And I thought the first and the 5th pillar are really applicable to CACFP, and the first one being on improving food access and affordability, ensuring kids have access to nutritious meals, a little bit of a focus on in the summer, but in reduce barriers to participation and involving community members in the design and implementation of federal assistance programs, which is this map did require community involvement in some ways with a small stakeholder group. So just to see that is possibly a pillar, if there's a way to engage on this with your state or lift this up. And then a 5th pillar, which calls on enhancing nutrition and food security research to improve federal assistance programs. So I think these maps provide a really great angle for that kind of research that can be lifted up. And I know that there isn't funding behind these challenges, but is there a hook to use, again, these story maps and sharing them with your federal and state policymakers to share that there's evidence of gaps in participation and recommendations that make sense that are needed to improve and expand the program. I think we have just a couple minutes left. I had one more slide if we want to move to it. If we have time, Nemours, please let me know if we have time to get into any sort of discussion. But we also just spewed a lot of information to you. And we're going to be joining the Q&A panel later. But if you do want to put some information in the chat or come off mute to answer some of these responses, we'd be happy to read them out. So that being, what are the biggest barriers to participation for CACFP in your state? Challenges around expanding participation. What is your agency or what is your state currently doing to improve participation? What strategies do you think are most impactful, and how could you use a story map like this in your state? So if you have any answers, oh yes, I'm already seeing some great message popped through, but if you'd like to spend a minute or two to type up a response, be happy to read that out. I see that in Alabama, nonprofit partners working closely with and supporting state agencies have made a huge difference in the work that has been done over the last few years in this field. I also know we have, so feel free to use the chat, but just thinking about, we're going back, okay. Just thinking about other responses we've heard. I know we heard from Colorado, just thinking about barriers that childcare providers have expressed current barriers to participation as having adequate and consistent staffing to manage all aspects of CACFP. Administering the program can be time consuming and a heavy lift. Administratively, there's a lot of required paperwork, and providers also experience limited kitchen space and proper equipment. If anyone else would like to chime in the chat or come off mute, we'd love to hear from you. Looking at, yep, Kentucky, too much paperwork to keep up with and fill out.
Has anybody heard from family childcare providers about reimbursement rates? That was a strategy that Diane mentioned about raising them up to the next level. We're curious, has that come up anywhere?
Yesterday, I was on the main stakeholder meeting call, and it came up in that call, Alex. They also vocalized one of the challenges they're facing is a loss of sponsor organizations. They're losing the largest sponsor organization in the state in September, and no one yet has stepped forward to fill that role. And there's a lot of chaos among family childcare providers. And again, as we've talked about on this call already, relationships are so important, and even relationships between an agency. So those family childcare home providers will be looking for new relationships with the sponsor.
There's actually a question earlier in the chat from Vivian about those declining figures in the National Family Childcare CACFP participation, and whether that reflects an overall decline in family childcares or a disproportionate decrease in CACFP participation, taking into account that decline in family childcare. So Diane, I don't know if you want to touch on that.
Thanks, Hannah. And sorry, Vivian, I started to type, but I was like, oh, there's so many different things I want to put into this. So it is easier just to say it out loud. But looking back first at the data that I had, that data is a little bit older now. So it'll be interesting to see when USDA puts out data about 2022 participation among family childcare programs and how big the loss is, if there is a loss. But it seems like that has been the downward trend for years and years. So I think it's probably safe to assume that there will be a bit of a loss. We also just put out data on supply, and I'm not remembering the exact number off the top of my head. I think it's around the 2% is the decline in family childcare programs over 2021 to 2022, which that decrease is actually smaller. It is smaller. It's still a decrease, but it's smaller than it has been in years past. So it'll be interesting to see the decreases and with the percentage of them now, since we've also had federal relief funding play a part in this too. Just a long-winded answer, but Alex, jump in.
Sure. Yeah, just to add to that, we haven't analyzed any of our data on CACFP to this effect. The closest that we got was we were able to have the opportunity, Rebecca, you mentioned Maine. We were able to work with the stakeholders and the good people in Maine in both the first year and the third year. And for their wild card choice, what we put our efforts to was looking at the change over time in CACFP participation. And Vivian, to your question, I just was scrolling back through that map, and while we didn't break that out by type of care, we did see raw number drops from pre-pandemic to, at that point, it was kind of enter to post. It was that late period where we didn't know if the pandemic was over or if it's not over, but pre-pandemic to late pandemic numbers, and there was an overall decrease in both the total supply of childcare and the CACFP supply of childcare. And while we didn't break it out by type of care, we did see a rate drop in CACFP as well, where it was a modest 3% drop from 48 to 45% of providers participating. So we don't know how that broke out from family childcare. My guess is that you're on to it, is that the decrease in national supply of family childcare is commensurate. I certainly think they would be related if we ran the numbers. To the extent to which it's CACFP specific, I don't know. It's a good research question.
Great. Well, thank you, Alex, Diane, and Jasmin for that great presentation. Just want to give one moment if anybody has any burning last questions to address to any of the folks from Child Care Aware. As a reminder, they will be joining us still a little bit later for a panel discussion. So I'll just give one moment in case anybody has a question they want to pop off mute.